What would it be like to feel no need to hide, no need to manage what you think of me, no need to pretend to be something I'm not, to feel seen and safe, to be naked and unashamed?
Chapter 1, Drowning. Why does life have to be so hard? That's a question that I've asked a lot these past few years. You've probably asked it too. But if you were to really press me on this and ask me as a pastor, if God is all powerful and able to take away our hardship, and he's all good, he really wants the best for us, then why doesn't he just take away all of our hardship? If you ask me that, I would say, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's a really good question, but I'm not sure I can or should answer for God. I mean, his ways are not my ways. His thoughts are not my thoughts. I don't want to pretend to know his mind or explain him for him. But if you press me, you were no, Paul, just don't you have any idea? What would you tell me? I would probably tell you a story about rats. A true story. So there was once an experiment conducted on two groups of rats. The first group was the lucky group. Lucky group, they were given the equivalent of a rat all-inclusive. Everything a rat could possibly want, I'm not making this up, they got it. If you wanted it, you got it. So amazing food, warm temperatures, mazes to explore. I don't know what rats love, but that's what they got. Whatever. The second group was not so lucky. They were put through a series of stressors. So they were intentionally given an infection. They were taken to the brink of starvation. They were placed into a bland environment with no stimulation, very little room to move. But here's the thing. Each time that group finished a stressor, they were then taken and they were then placed into the rat all-inclusive, and they were restored to full health before they faced the next stressor. So after months of conditioning the two groups in this way, they then took all of them, both groups, and they dropped them into a bucket of water, and they started a timer. How long will they swim before they give up and drown? Terrible, I know. I'd feel bad if they weren't rats. So here's the question, which group do you think gave up first? Yep. The rats who had never faced anything hard in their whole lives, they just drown. They just quickly, right off the bat, they can't take it, they give up, and they drown. But the rats who'd suffered hard things and then been brought through it multiple times, they would hold on 2, 3, 4, 5 times longer than the rats who had never suffered anything. That resilience was built into them. No real surprise there. But here's the part where the researchers were surprised. When they then went and studied their little rat brains, they found that those who had suffered repeatedly hardship and then been brought through it, they showed a level of integration in their brain that was markedly different. The very structure of their brain was different from those who had not faced any hardship. Their neural network was much, much more densely connected. And it suggested that the rats who had faced hardship were then able to know and experience and process life in a way that the rats that had never experienced hardship, simply could not. It suggested that the brain requires a certain amount of stress in order to fully develop, that without stress, they could not mature. So I wonder, do you think this is just a story about rats? 2018, I had this surreal experience. I got to go study at Cambridge, the Cambridge, and I was at this lecture with Oxford psychologist and Anglican priest. She's phenomenal, Dr. Joanna Collicott. And in this, she pointed something out that has stuck with me. She said, trauma is becoming more and more common in the Western world, and it seems to have nothing to do with incidents of violence, abuse, abandonment, danger, the usual culprits. Yes, if someone goes through that, you would assume they're going to experience trauma in their life. But she said, if anything, in the places where our world is safer than ever before, easier than ever before, among wealthy, educated, safe people, trauma's on the rise. And then she went on to describe how she's seen time and again as a professor at Oxford that some of her brilliant, elite, wealthy students would get the equivalent of a B for her course, and their whole world would collapse. They would suffer panic attacks, insomnia, drop into clinical depression. For them, it was truly, they experienced it as trauma because they didn't get an A. And this, she said, is becoming increasingly common. So what happens when someone who's never faced anything hard is faced with what most of us would consider small failure, a small challenge or difficulty? They drown. We drown. So what happens when we grow up in an era when technology promises, to quote the author King Andy Crouch, easy always? What happens when a digital coping mechanism is always in our hands and we never have to sit with anything hard? What happens when we so protect our kids, bubble wrap them and check all their candy at Halloween and put on a helmet on everything, and then everyone gets an award? What happens when you live in a time and a place when everything you want, you can get it for free delivery the next day with Amazon? What happens when someone who has only known easy faces something hard? They drown, we drown. So if you always choose the easy, you will never be able to do the hard. You will become the kind of person who only has the capacity to do what is easy. And the evidence suggests that your brain might not fully develop, that there are whole experiences, connections, feelings, ways of seeing the world that you simply cannot know, cannot experience, because you've never developed that capacity. It seems that the brain requires a certain amount of stress, not overwhelming stress, but a certain amount of stress in order to fully mature, that if you want to become fully who you're created to be, you have to suffer. Now, of course, not all suffering is good. In fact, I'd be hesitant to call any suffering good. I really would. But the biblical authors, they're not so hesitant. They're not so guarded on this one. They seem to suggest that suffering should almost be celebrated, like uncomfortably so. So James, the brother of Jesus, famously starts his letter like this: "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kind." To which we say, James, are you mad? What are you talking about? And then he goes on to explain himself. Why would you consider it pure joy? Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete and not lacking anything. That trial and testing is the primary way in which we become mature and complete, not lacking anything. Or to say it conversely, without trials and testing, you will never become mature. You will never become who you're called to be. You will always feel like you're lacking something because you are. So James says, consider it joy. That in some sense, we should welcome hardship, delight in suffering, find it joyful, not because suffering's good, but because of what it's doing in us. Now, if this was just James, I might write him off as like, okay, he's masochist. There's a problem. We'll skip that book and go on to the other ones. But then we go to the book of Romans, the gospel laid out by the Apostle Paul. And in Romans chapter 5, he says this: "We boast in the hope of the glory of God." And I'm like, yes, amen. And then he goes on, not only so, we also glory in our sufferings. We revel in them. We delight in them. We celebrate them. We consider our sufferings to be weighty and monumental and significant to our life. We hold those up as treasures, as mile markers in our life. Why? Why, Paul? Because we know suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So suffering is not good, but it serves a good end. It is the way to the life and love that we really want. In this past week alone, 2 people from our church have shared with me how God used cancer to open up things in their lives and in the lives of others that never could have happened, that they never could have experienced or known if they hadn't had cancer. They seemed almost thankful for cancer. Now, did I hear that and then pray, "Dear Jesus, give me cancer"? No! I spend my weeks eating terrible foods. Ask my family, specifically to avoid getting cancer. And if one of you gets cancer, I'm going to immediately pray that God takes it away. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But do I believe that God can use cancer in my life or in your life to open up something that I never could have known or experienced without it? I do. According to the scriptures, an easy life isn't necessarily a better life. In this fallen world, it seems that some suffering is actually essential, like needed. Like if you want to become fully who you're created to be, you have to suffer. Chapter 2. Why do we hold hands? So humans are fundamentally what David Brooks refers to as social animals. Like isolation, loneliness, they do terrible things to us. You can demonstrate this, through all kinds of psychologically, medically, sociologically. You can demonstrate, you can prove this, right? But you don't have to do that. You just have to watch the History Channel show Alone. Anyone? Where they take someone and they drop them off in the wilderness and they say, "Now see if you can survive." And for the first couple episodes, it's awesome, like this survival show about finding water and building shelters and food. But then you get about halfway through the season, and everyone's like weeping and talking about their father wound. Because if you leave someone alone for 20, 30, 40 days, it does terrible things to their soul. It's exposing. So the scriptures, they describe us as being created in the image of God. What kind of God? In a God who himself is fundamentally, can only be understood, only be known as a relationship. And one God who exists in three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So according to the scriptures, reality is fundamentally personal and relational. Like reality, the stuff in and under and behind all things is not stuff. It's persons. And these things, before all things, are not it's not like some cosmic event, bang, that started everything. It's a relationship. The logos, the logic, the meaning of the way all things, the grand unified theory, let's use that language, is not like a scientific law or principle. It's a relationship. The only way you can understand everything in life and integrate all knowledge together is in an unbreakable, undividable, eternal relationship between three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, unity, diversity. And we are created to reflect that reality, which suggests you can't do it on your own. This is famously captured in a verse we looked at a couple weeks ago. It is not good for human to be alone. It's not good. That in order to find the fullness of life, to fully become who we're created to be, we need to share our lives with others. And I would suggest this is particularly true in suffering. So if you want to fully become who you're created to be, you have to suffer with others. UVA's James Cone, he tells a story. He's a PhD professor. Tells a story about working at a hospital and working with a vet who had 80-something years old, had seen the horrors of war, and was experiencing PTSD. And so as he got older, it became harder and harder to control or manage the symptoms. It got worse and worse. So James said, "Okay, come meet with me. We'll talk through this." He sat him down and said, "Here's what I'm going to do in my therapy. Are you willing to go through this track?" And the man said, "Sure. I do have one qualification, though. My wife has to come with me." He'd been married 60 years at that point. It was like, my wife has to be there with me. And he thought, this is kind of weird. Like, what does she have to do with this? This is your treatment, but okay. And then they show up for their session. They're sitting across from him, and he says, "Okay, now the first thing we need to do is we need to process some of these stories. You need to share some of the war stories so that we can start to unearth what they're doing in you." And his answer was, "No!" He's like, "Okay." let's start with a relaxation technique. He's like, what we're going to do is we're going to tense up our body, and then we're going to release so that you can feel what it feels like to be relaxed and see the tension in your body. And the guy said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then his wife took his hand and immediately started the relaxation technique. And then afterwards, he looked at him and said, okay, now we do need to get to those stories. We need you to start to share what's going on. And he said, no. Again, his wife reached over, took his hand, and the moment she took his hand, the stories just started flowing. He said this happened again and again, so much so that he was, as a scientist, he was curious, like, what just happened? What did I just witness here? There's something about this man is absolutely opposed to it. He can't do it. He's terrified of doing it. Everything in him is stopping him from doing it. But the moment his wife takes his hand, he's able to do what he was unable to do a moment ago. What's going on? And so he did what a scientist does. He says, let's scan their brains while they do this, right? He's like, he asked the question, why do we hold hands? Specifically, how do holding hands affect your ability to cope with stress? So he took people and he placed them into a brain imaging machine. He said, but it needed to be a stressful situation, which is helpful because brain imaging machines are really uncomfortable. And he said, but that wasn't enough. And what he was going to do is he strapped a little thing to their ankle, and every once in a while he would randomly shock them. Which I just think that's great. So he would randomly administer electrical shocks to their ankle and just see, now let's see what happens to them when we put them in this machine. So he started out, he just took different groups of people. Started with a group of people and just said, you alone, you're going to go in the machine, and then every once in a while, zap. And he says, when you zap someone and they're sitting alone in that machine, as you might imagine, and I quote, their brain would light up like a Christmas tree. All the regions where the emotions are like flaring, and regions that force you to exert social control and regulate so that you don't do something inappropriate, like start cussing at the nurse. And then the regions of your brain that start plotting, like, how can I get out of here? All those regions, they just lit up. But then he had a second group do the same things, but this time he had a complete stranger hold their hand while they were doing it. And he said, you could tell the difference. It totally muted their response. Same response, but muted. But then he said the third group is where the real difference was seen. They were asked to hold the hand of a friend or loved one. And the brain imaging showed a marked difference. It was as if holding the hand of their friend or loved one regulated their emotions, their fears, quieted their need to find a solution and escape the situation. Their brain reacted, and I quote, as if they were medicated. Like it was medicine. As if their brain somehow, their friend somehow regulated their brain for them. So James, he was curious and thought, now, I wonder what's happening in the brain of the person not getting shocked. So he strapped a diode to the person holding their hand and shocked them too. Yeah, I should get into that. So here's where things get really weird. When you experience your close friend getting shocked, your brain reacts as though you're getting shocked. He said from the brain images alone, you can hardly tell who is getting shocked, you or your close friend. It's as if the experience, the stress, the pain is shared by the two brains. He was amazed. But if you've ever held the hand of someone going through immense pain, hearing terrible news, grieving deeply, maybe you're not so surprised. I wonder if this is what the Apostle Paul meant when he says in Philippians, I want to know Christ. I want to know him. And the power of his resurrection, yes, I need that life. And the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. Do you hear this language? The fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. It's as if Paul is so close to Christ. He wants to know him so intimately, like he's holding his hand, that in some sense he's sharing in his sufferings. That what Christ has suffered on the cross, Paul feels it, he experiences. Like his brain lights up like a Christmas tree just thinking about it. So much so that Paul's whole life is reshaped by it. Like it's happened to him. Like I am now crucified with Christ. In fact, my whole life is now cross-shaped. It's shaped by what Christ experienced, and now, somehow, through this shared suffering, Paul experiences new life. He discovers that not only is he sharing Christ's sufferings, but Christ is sharing his. And somehow, in suffering, he experiences the presence and love of Christ in a way that transforms him. It births in him new life, resurrection life, life that cannot be conquered by suffering. It swallows it up in joy. So if you read the writings of the Apostle Paul, you find that this is not just like something that happens between like me and Jesus, but it also happens between me and you. Everyone who's united their life with Christ is now united to one another. And he uses this metaphor of a body so that, 1 Corinthians 12, if one member suffers, the whole body suffers. All the members suffer with it. So like if I stub my little toe, my whole body reels in pain. And that's the way we are created to be, to share in each other's sufferings. We're designed to share our sufferings with one another, the way a whole body aches. And he says that a little more directly and in command style in Galatians chapter 6. Listen to this. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. That if you want to fulfill the law of Christ, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and so everything you have, everything you are, and then love your neighbor as yourself. If you want to live in that love and experience the love that Christ lived, well, then you need to carry each other's burdens. Your brain needs to light up like a Christmas tree when I'm suffering, and mine needs to do the same for you. You can't carry it on your own. You were never supposed to. You need someone else to hold your hand just as much as I need you to hold my hand. But there's one part that complicates this a little bit. It's the burdens to which Paul is referring to here are not just like illness. It's not just cancer and tragedy and an accident and unemployment and life's disappointments. Those are certainly included in the burdens that we're supposed to carry for one another. But this verse, he's specifically talking about sin. One verse prior reads, "Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently, but watch yourselves, or you may be tempted." Then he says, carry each other's burdens. That when the person next to you is caught in sin, that's when you need to carry their burdens. That's when you need to hold their hand. That's when you need to love them the way Christ loves you when you sin against him. That you are to love them when they are unlovely, when they wrong you, when they wound you, when they mess your life up. That you're to love them when you're so frustrated with them that you can hardly stand it. That's when they most need you. That's when you must carry their burdens. That's when you hold their hand and remind them of Christ's love. So get the implication here. We not only need to suffer with others in the sense that we need to hold the hand of the person who's going through suffering and bear their burdens for them. Here, Paul's saying something much more difficult. He says we need to suffer with others when they've caused the suffering. Because they're broken and hurtful and unlovely. They cause the burden. They are the burden. You need to suffer with them then. He's talking about suffering with the faults of others, the way Christ suffers with you when you sin against him. Paul's talking about suffering with the weakness, the pettiness, the confusion, the frustration that comes from sharing your life with others. So here's the part of the sermon where it can't just be an idea. Love those people. This is the part of the sermon where you need to have faces come up in your mind. You need to remember the way others have wounded you. You need to identify the people who have sinned against you, or at least in ways that have made your life really, really difficult. Because those are the people. He's calling you to carry their burden, hold their hand. And James adds, and consider it pure joy. So, in the scriptures, these two ways of suffering with others come together to form us in the love of Christ. Others cause the suffering, the stress, the hardship, the testing that makes us more like Christ, and they alleviate the suffering by holding our hands when we are suffering. And we need to suffer with others in both ways in order to become more like Christ. If you want to become fully who you're created to be, you have to suffer with others, and you have to suffer with others. Chapter 3. Imagine peeling an orange. So when Jenny was pregnant with our first, I'm not sure how seriously I took the whole thing. Like, I was like, I mean, come on. Everyone who's ever been born has gone through this, right? Like, this is just something that people do. Literally everyone in the world has been through this. It can't be that bad. So I'm like, okay, we go to these birthing classes because I'm a supportive man. And we show up there and we end up with all these moms who, every last one of them was like a natural birthing, like, Mom, we're like, good for you. I don't know, personally, I want to take drugs just thinking about it. But the instructor was very, very serious about the whole thing and really thought anyone who takes this seriously should do a natural birth method. And so she was going to teach us how to manage the pain without drugs. And she started, okay, we all get in our room, we're all sitting in this, and she lowers the lights, and then she's like, breathe in, breathe out. Now, while we're closing our eyes, she says, now imagine peeling an orange. And so I have this terrible habit of laughing at the most inappropriate times. And I'm just sitting there picturing my wife in labor, and I'm like, imagine peeling an orange, how that would go. And I just start laughing. And my wife looks at me, and she starts laughing. And I thought we were going to get kicked out of the class. So, but then a couple weeks later, a friend of ours, Kristen, she had her baby first. And we were so excited to see them. They show up at church, and we take one look at her, and we're like, we don't know what to say. Have you ever seen one of those movies where someone gets bit by a zombie? You know what happens to their eyes? Yeah, that's what it looked like. And we're like, hi, how are you? And she's like, oh, good now. And then she explains what happened. The pain of delivery was so excruciating that every blood vessel in her eyes burst. And I was like, imagine peeling an orange. Imagine peeling an orange. Okay, this is the image that the Apostle Paul chooses to use when he describes suffering, or suffering with one another for the sake of Christ. Listen to this, Galatians chapter 4. My dear children, whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. How I wish that I could be with you now and change my tone because I am perplexed by you. So let's set this up a little. Chapter 1, he starts writing a letter to the Galatians and says, I hear that you're preaching, someone's preaching among you a different gospel, read heresy. And then in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 1, he then tells them, anyone who believes and proclaims this other gospel, let them be eternally condemned, which can literally be translated, they can go to hell. I'm not being rude here. That's what it means. If you preach a different gospel in the church of Jesus Christ, you can go to hell. And then in chapter 2 and 3, he exposes the lies and the divisions, and he names names. He explains that he had to call out the Apostle Peter himself for sin. And then by chapter 4, he starts to soften a little bit, but then he mentions how he personally suffered a terrible illness and how they suffered knowing that he was suffering. And that brings us to chapter 4, verse 19. How does Paul make sense of all of this pain, suffering, frustration, hurt, hard conversations? He says, I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. The pains of childbirth. Now, I can only imagine what childbirth would have been like in the first century. Like no hospitals, no painkillers, just like screaming and praying that it all works out. But I want you to hear the point of this metaphor is not the pain of childbirth. It's that childbirth is not endless suffering without purpose. It's not. The end of this suffering is life. New life. Paul says that's what this suffering is. My suffering with you, your suffering with me, it's not mere suffering. It's suffering with a purpose. It's suffering that forms Christ in you. It's suffering that ends in life, new life. Now, most people, they don't usually show up at church thinking, these people are really going to make me suffer. In fact, it's just the opposite. You've been beat up in the world, and you come in here and just desperate for, someone please hold my hand and suffer with me and make this a little less painful. What they don't expect is that the very person who's holding their hand is also a sinner, and given enough time is going to make them suffer too. The Apostle Paul, though, he seems to be suggesting that suffering with people who sin against you is purposeful, is essential, is part of how the life of Christ is formed in you. That if you've never been sinned against, how are you ever going to learn how to forgive like Christ? If you've never had a terrible rupture in your relationship with someone, how are you ever going to be a minister of reconciliation like Christ? If you've never been around people who annoy you and hold you back and don't think like you, how are you going to become long-suffering and patient and gentle like Christ? If you only go to a church with people who look like you and think like you and vote like you, how are you ever going to love your neighbor as yourself, much less your enemy? If everything is exactly to your taste and preference, how are you ever going to learn to pray, not my will, but yours be done? That if you want to become fully who you're created to be, you have to suffer with others, and you have to suffer with others. So in the 1940s, when German Christians en masse bowed the knee to Hitler, I don't know if you know this, but during Nazism, the German church, most of the German church, Christians, became a Nazi expression of Christianity. Most. Millions of German Christians bowed the knee to Hitler. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer resisted. In fact, in 1945, he was actually killed for this. He had this stunning little book called Life Together, in which he describes his attempt to form a Christian community that could withstand the pressures of Nazism. And in it, he suggests that if we are actually going to become a church that can withstand the pressures of this world, like do not be conformed, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, then the first thing that needs to happen is we all need to become, his word, disillusioned. That if you come looking for some perfect, idyllic community in which everyone is nice and everyone loves one another and nothing ever hurts and everything is easy, you need to get over it. This is worth quoting at length. Only that fellowship which faces such disillusionment with all its unhappy and ugly aspects begins to be what it should be in God's sight. The sooner this shock of disillusionment comes to an individual and to a community, the better for both. A community which cannot bear and cannot survive such a crisis, which insists on keeping its illusion when it should be shattered, permanently loses in that moment the promise of Christian community. Sooner or later, it'll collapse. Every human wish dream that is injected into the Christian community is a hindrance to genuine community and must be banished if genuine community is to survive. He who loves his dream of a community, more than the Christian community itself becomes the destroyer of the latter, even though his personal intentions may be ever so honest and earnest and sacrificial. So I'm thinking about making this part of our new to new story class. Yeah. Hi, I'm Paul. We're so glad you're here. Here's a mug. Look how cool it is. We're cool. Today, I want to take a moment to shatter any idea that you have of church. I want to disillusion you. God sent us here to make you suffer. Anyone want to sign up? Anyone? Yeah. Don't worry. If it's too disturbing, just imagine peeling an orange. Chapter 4. Love like a monk. So about 2 hours south of Rome, right off the main highway to Naples, you'll find this. It's called Monte Cassino. If you ask my kids to tell you about it, they'll tell you not about the place on the top of the hill. They'll tell you about this gas station. because we went to the restaurant, and this was the first place where they actually tried arancini, the Italian fried rice balls. They're amazing, yeah. And then the waitress was so nice. She spoke no English, but she gave my kids free cookies, and they just... So if you ever get past the arancini and the cookies, and you actually go up the hill, you will find this. This is the place where in 529 AD, Benedict of Nursia founded a community of Jesus followers that to this day have changed the world. They continue to change the world. So by the 500s, Italy was just chaotic. It was a mess. Social, political, economic chaos everywhere. Rome had fallen, and with it, anything that you'd recognize as like social order had just collapsed. There's a reason why we call this the Dark Ages, right? So in the midst of like this traumatic, violent, chaotic time, followers of Jesus were asking, like, what now? Like, how do we follow Christ in a world that's gone insane? Like, what does it look like to follow Jesus when everything we thought we knew was true has been turned upside down? It's no longer true. We don't know what true is anymore. So Benedict, his answer was to form a community that would live a different way of life. He saw that no matter what you believe, if you continue to live like everyone else, eventually you will become like everyone else. So he argued, you don't just need a conversion of your heart, you do, but you need, and I quote, a conversion of habits. You need to change your habits, the way you live. So he wrote what is famously called the Rule of St. Benedict. If you want to be part of our community, he said, this is how you eat, work, sleep, dress, pray. And it's quite detailed, way more mundane than you might imagine, like little details like how you eat and who you eat with and where you sleep and what you wear can make a big, big difference in the formation of community. But part of the genius of Benedict, why he succeeded where others failed, was in his preconditions or prerequisites. Because lots of people had rules. Lots of people told you how to live. Lots of people tried to force this from a top down, but he didn't go about it that way. And in fact, what's really critical is how you become part of the community, as spelled out in chapter 58. Listen to this. Do not grant newcomers to the monastic life an easy entry, but as the apostle says, test the spirits to see if they are from God. Therefore, if someone comes and keeps knocking at the door, and if at the end of 4 or 5 days has shown himself patient in bearing his harsh treatment and difficulty of entry, and has persisted in his request, then he should be allowed to enter and stay in the guest quarters for a few days. So if you come knocking at the door, and you keep knocking at the door for 4 or 5 days, then we'll let you in. And then we're going to watch you. We're going to put someone next to you to just watch your life for 6 months. And then we're going to sit there and we're going to read all of the rules, the rule of St. Benedict to you. And we're going to ask you, can you keep these for the rest of your life till the day you die? Can you swear to that? Can you live by this voluntarily till the day you die? And if they say, yes, I can do that, then you make them wait 4 more months. And then you do the whole thing again. You see, prerequisite number 1. Why did he succeed where others failed? Well, he said prerequisite number 1 is you have to want this. If we try to force a different way of life on you, it'll be terrible for everyone involved. You have to choose this one for yourself. It has to be voluntary. If this suffering is to be for your benefit, you have to choose it or at least accept it. Otherwise, it's just abuse. You have to choose to suffer for the sake of others. And then if you pass that test, there are 2 more things we need to know that you know. But he must be well aware that from this day he is no longer free to leave the monastery, nor shake from his neck the yoke of the rule which, in the course of so prolonged a period of reflection, he was either free to either reject or to accept. So prerequisite number 2, if you've freely chosen this, you have to now swear to obey and stay forever. Till the day you die. So to this day, if you go to a Benedictine monastery, when they perform a funeral, they don't just bury the one, they dig the next hole so that you know that's where I'm going. That one's for me. That's my end. This is my end. This is where I'm going to be buried. So you're taking a vow of obedience. I won't do what I want. I'll do what everyone else wants. And stability. I'm going to stay here forever. You're swearing that you will give up everything you want for the sake of others. No matter how painful it is, you will remain in this community until you die. And then, after you swear those things, you then, in front of the entire community, strip naked, completely naked. And now, in your birthday suit, you're born again to a new way of life. A way of life that is not your own, does not belong to you. A life that is committed and bound up with others for the sake of others. I'm thinking about making this our new membership process. Okay, we're not all called to be monks. But do you see what Benedict's up to here? Do you see the genius of this? He makes entry into their community hard, difficult, almost repulsive. Like, come and die. That's his invitation, so that everyone who signs on the dotted line realizes what they're getting themselves into. This is not a way to make myself better. This is not a way to make my life better. It's not a way to get what I want in life. It's not a way to fulfill my desires or dreams, because the only way to fully become who I am created to be is to stop worrying about becoming who I'm created to be and start worrying about you. The only way to become fully who I'm created to be is to get over myself, to forget about myself, to become a servant of all, to actually love you and God more than I even love myself, to not even think about myself, not because I'm not loved, but because other things are more important to me. And servanthood and suffering, it's not a barrier to the way. It is the way. Now, where would Benedict get an idea like this? If you live in a world that has gone insane, a world that seems to be destroying even the possibility of faith, well, you have to find a whole new way of life. And Benedict knew what the apostle knew, what Jesus lived. You can't do it on your own. You can't force somebody to do it. You can't do it only so long as it feels good or like it's working for you. You have to commit to a different way of life and to one another. You have to learn to give up what you want for the sake of others. You have to suffer with others and suffer with others. And it might feel horrific. It might feel like the pains of childbirth, but this is how the life of Christ is formed in us. This is where we stop conforming to this world and begin being transformed by the renewing of our minds. This is where we create a space safe enough that when I sin, someone can take my hand and heal something broken in me and heal something broken in them. If you want to become fully who you're created to be, you have to suffer with others. And you have to suffer with others. Father, I pray for the grace to be able to walk in this. It is a hard road and a hard word in a world that tells us we should only get what we want, in a world that tries to make everything so easy for us, Lord. You call us to a hard way, a hard path. You call us to come and die, to follow Christ to the cross, and there, through the cross, to find our life. God, I don't pretend like this is easy or that we can be where the apostles are and consider it yet pure joy or glory in it yet. But Lord, I pray that we would become a community where that is possible, where we could see the joy, where we could experience the glory. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.